I was 20 years old the day my father handed me over to a monster and called it protection.
He didn't say it like that, of course.
My father, Marco Antonio, never said anything plainly. He spoke in half-sentences and heavy silences, the way men do when they've spent their whole lives hiding truth inside pretty packaging. "You'll stay with Albert," he told me, buttoning his coat at the door of our Staten Island estate.
His eyes were already somewhere else.
Somewhere overseas, where a cartel dispute was apparently more urgent than his own daughter. "He'll keep you safe." I remember staring at the back of his head and thinking, safe from what? Or safe from whom?
I had grown up in the shadow of my father's world. I knew what the men who came to our house were.
I knew why certain names were never spoken above a whisper. I had been kept carefully on the edges of it all, like a vase placed near a fire. Decorative, fragile, always at risk of falling.
Albert Romano was not on the edges.
Albert Romano was the fire.
He was standing in our driveway when my father's convoy pulled away.
4 to 5 years old, built like a man who had never once in his life taken the easy road. Tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark coat like he had been poured into it. His hair was shot through with early silver at the temples, and his jaw was the kind of hard that didn't come from the gym. It came from decades of clenching it around things he refused to say.
He had cold eyes. Everyone said so.
Gray-green, the color of a river right before a storm. They had watched me grow up from a distance, those eyes. They had always looked straight through me.
He looked at me now the same way he always had. Like I was a task on a list.
"Your room is ready," he said. No greeting. No warmth.
He turned and walked back toward the house.
I grabbed my bags and followed him, burning with a quiet, familiar humiliation.
I had worshipped this man since I was 14 years old. That was the embarrassing truth I carried around like a stone in my chest.
I had watched him stand beside my father at every important moment of our lives. I had seen him take a bullet for the Antonio family when I was just a child, had heard the story repeated so many times it had become mythology. Albert Romano was loyal the way mountains were loyal, solid, immovable, and entirely indifferent to the weather around them. For 6 years, I had told myself the feeling would pass.
It had not passed. But I was 20 now.
I was not the little girl who used to spy on him from the top of the staircase anymore.
I had a degree in finance half completed.
I had opinions and ambitions and a mouth I had learned to use sharply.
I was tired of being treated like something to be stored.
I was tired of being invisible to the one person I most wanted to be seen by. Albert's estate in Westchester was the kind of house that told you everything about the man who owned it. Beautiful, expensive, and completely without warmth.
Dark wood floors. High ceilings.
Art on the walls that looked chosen for investment, not feeling.
Every room was immaculate.
Every surface was ordered.
There was no softness anywhere.
I had been there less than 3 hours when he called me into his study and handed me a folded piece of paper.
"Rules," he said. I unfolded it. There were 8 of them. Curfew at 10.
No leaving the property without an escort.
No phone calls on unsecured lines.
No visitors without prior approval.
No access to the East Wing.
I looked up at him. "You're serious?"
"Always."
"I'm 20 years old, Albert.
And you're in my house." His voice was flat. "Absolute. While you're here, you follow my rules. Your father trusted me with your safety."
"I don't take that lightly."
"Your father. Always my father. My father's trust. My father's daughter. That was all I ever was to him. What if I don't?"
I asked, just to see what he would do.
He didn't blink.
"Then I will personally drive you to a safe house in Connecticut, where you will spend the next 3 months seeing no one and going nowhere. Your choice, Jessica."
He said my name like it was a full stop at the end of a sentence.
Like the conversation was already over.
I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. "Fine." He nodded, already turning back to his desk. Dismissing me.
I walked out of his study and stood in the hallway, gripping the folded paper until my knuckles ached.
Fine, I thought. But I was not fine.
I was furious, and heartbroken, and more dangerously aware of him than ever. Because Albert Romano, at 4 to 5, in his perfectly ordered house, with his cold eyes and his 8 rules, was the most magnetic person I had ever stood near in my life.
And he didn't even know I existed. The first rule I broke was the curfew. It wasn't even deliberate.
I had fallen asleep in the library at 11:30, buried in one of his books, and woken up to find a blanket draped over my shoulders that had not been there before. I sat up, disoriented, and found Albert standing in the doorway in the dark. He said nothing. He just looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read, then turned and walked away. I held the blanket against my chest and told myself it meant nothing.
He was just being practical. He didn't want me getting sick.
It was a liability thing.
The second rule I broke was deliberate.
It was a Thursday evening, 10 days into my stay. I had been slowly losing my mind inside that beautiful, silent house. His guards were everywhere, polite and immovable. His housekeeper, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Wren, watched me with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for stray cats near expensive furniture. Albert himself was rarely home before midnight. When he was there, he was behind the closed doors of his study, or on the phone, or conducting quiet meetings with serious-faced men in the dining room that I was not invited to attend.
I missed feeling like a person.
So I put on a red dress I had brought from home, walked down the main staircase at 8 in the evening, and told the guard at the door that I was going to the garden. Then I walked straight past the garden and out the side gate. I made it exactly 40 minutes before Albert's car pulled up alongside me on the road leading to the village.
The window rolled down. He looked at me from the driver's seat. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me in that red dress in the evening light with those gray-green eyes, and something moved across his face so fast I almost missed it. Almost. Then it was gone. Sealed behind the wall. "Get in," he said. I got in. We drove back in silence. When we reached the house, he parked and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. "Do you understand?" he said quietly. "What would happen to you if the wrong people knew you were walking alone on an open road?" Nothing happened. This time. He turned to look at me then, and the weight of it was almost physical. "I gave your father my word, Jessica. Do not make me a liar." There it was again. My father. His word. The promise. I was always the thing to be protected, never the person to be considered. "Maybe," I said, "you could try talking to me like I'm an adult instead of a problem you've been assigned." Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. "Go inside," he said. I went inside. But I was shaking, and not from fear. It happened on a rainy Saturday, 3 weeks in. We had been circling each other for days with a tension so thick I could taste it in the back of my throat. He was home more than usual. I would look up from a book and find him watching me from across a room, and he would look away immediately, his jaw tight. We ate dinner at opposite ends of his long table and had conversations about nothing that was somehow more charged than anything I had ever said to anyone. I had started to believe, recklessly and against all better judgment, that I was not imagining it. That evening, I came downstairs in a loose shirt and bare feet, my hair down. I found him in the kitchen, which surprised me. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water, still in his work clothes, his shirt collar open. He looked tired in a way he never let anyone see. He looked human. I walked in and sat up on the counter the way I used to at home, just to have somewhere to be. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, something I had read, something on the news. His voice was different in the kitchen, lower, less guarded. He almost smiled once at something I said. I felt it happen, the shift in the air. The way the space between us became something I was suddenly, desperately aware of. I looked at him, and I said, "Albert, I need to ask you something." He set down his glass. His eyes came to mine. "Ask." "Do you ever look at me?" I said. "Actually, look. Not like I'm something to be managed. Like I'm a person." The room went very still. "Jessica." "Because I look at you," I said, and my voice didn't shake, even though everything inside me was trembling. "I have for a long time. And I know what you're going to say. I know all the reasons. But I needed you to know that I see you. Not my father's best friend. Not my guardian. You." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Then Albert Romano looked at me with those storm-colored eyes, and what was in them wasn't what I had hoped for. It was something worse. It was pity, wrapped around something he was working very hard to crush. "You're a child chasing a fantasy," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, merciless. "You've been here 3 weeks with nothing to do, and you've confused proximity for feeling. I am not a romantic figure, Jessica. I am your father's friend. That is all I will ever be to you." The words landed like cold water. I got off the counter. I kept my face very still, the way my father had always taught me, never show the wound. "Understood," I said. I walked upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I did not let myself cry until I heard his footsteps pass my door and continue down the hall. He had rejected me. Clearly,
completely, and without cruelty that was anything other than necessary.
And somehow that made it worse. She arrived on a Tuesday evening in a silver car. Her name was Dora Vance. She was 38.
Dark-haired, elegant, with the polished ease of a woman who had spent her whole life in expensive rooms. She wore a camel coat and pearl earrings, and she shook my hand with cool, practiced warmth and called me darling within the first 5 minutes. Albert introduced her as someone he was seeing. I smiled. I kept smiling for the entire dinner, through the wine and the soft laughter and the way Dora touched Albert's arm when she wanted his attention. I watched her from across the table with the careful, analytical part of my brain that I usually reserved for numbers.
She was performing.
I could see it in the micro-expressions, the calculated angles of her smile.
She was very good. But she was performing.
What I could not figure out, not that night, was who she was performing for. I found out later, in pieces, that Dora Vance had been hired. Albert had brought her in deliberately, a controlled variable in the equation, a way of drawing a line between himself and me that he could point to and say, "This is the border.
Do not cross it." But I didn't know that yet.
All I knew that night was that she was there, and he was looking at her the way I had always wanted him to look at me. I excused myself early, pleading a headache. In my room, I stood at the window and watched the lights of Westchester spread out below me like a fallen constellation. I thought about the kitchen, about the words he had used. Child chasing a fantasy. I thought, fine. If he wanted to see a child, I would show him exactly how wrong he was. Over the following week, Dora was at the house constantly. She was charming and unreadable, and she watched me with a smile that never quite matched her eyes. I watched her back. Whatever her arrangement with Albert was, she was beginning to go off script. I could see it in the way she stood closer to him than a hired companion needed to. In the way she watched him when he wasn't looking. The performance was becoming something more complicated. Albert, for his part, was doing what Albert always did. He was executing the plan with military precision and pretending he didn't notice anything else. He noticed everything. I knew that much about him. What he kept failing to notice was the thing I could no longer pretend wasn't there. Because Dora Vance might have been there to build a wall. But walls, I had learned, work both ways. I broke 3 rules the night of the Mercer Club. I left the house without permission. I went to a venue that Albert had not approved. I stayed past midnight. I told myself it was about freedom. About proving something. About the unbearable weight of the last month trapped in that beautiful, silent house with a man who would not look at me and a woman whose smile was a lock on a door. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I was in pain. And when I was in pain, I made bad decisions. The Mercer was a private members club in the city, the kind of place where old money and new danger sat at the same bar and pretended not to know each other. My friend Celia had gotten us in through a connection I didn't ask too many questions about. The first hour was fine. I danced. I drank 1 glass of champagne and nursed a second. Celia was laughing beside me, and the music was loud. And for a little while, I managed to feel like a person my own age living her own life. Then Celia disappeared into the crowd, and a man sat down beside me. His name, I learned later, was Reese Holton. The son of a crime family from New Jersey that operated in direct competition with several of my father's allies. He was handsome in the obvious, careless way of men who have never been told no. He smiled at me and offered to buy me a drink. I said yes. Another bad decision in a night full of them. I didn't finish the drink. I know that now because what happened next doesn't track with the 1 glass of champagne I'd had. The room tilted. The music went strange and distant. Reese Holton was suddenly very close, his hand on my arm, guiding me toward a back hallway, and I couldn't make my legs cooperate the way they should have. I remember thinking, very clearly through the fog, I need Albert. And then the back door opened from the outside. Albert Romano walked through it like a man who had been told where to be and had arrived precisely on time to be terrifying about it. He was in dark clothing, no tie, his face a mask of absolute and complete murder. Beside him was Gregor, his head of security, and 2 other men I recognized from the estate. Reese Holton made the mistake of not immediately removing his hand from my arm. Albert didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at Reese Holton the way a surgeon looks at something that needs to be removed, and he said 2 words. Let go. Reese let go. I don't remember clearly what happened in the minutes that followed. Albert had his arm around me, holding me upright, and the cold night air was hitting my face, and I was trying very hard to say something coherent and failing completely. What I remember is this, his voice in my ear, low and steady and furious. I have you. You're safe. Stay with me, Jessica.
The men who had been with Reese Holton that night disappeared before sunrise. Albert never told me what happened to them. He didn't need to. I was sick for most of the next day.
Whatever had been in that drink moved through my system slowly and miserably, and I spent hours drifting in and out of a restless, anxious sleep.
Albert sat in the chair by the window of my room. Not every minute. He had things to do, people to handle, consequences to manage. But every time I surfaced from sleep, he was either there or had just been. There was always water on the nightstand.
The curtains were adjusted to keep the light from being too harsh. At some point in the late afternoon, I woke up properly. He was there, reading, his reading glasses on, which I had never seen before.
They made him look different. Less like a monument and more like a man.
"You have glasses," I said.
My voice was hoarse. He looked up.
He took the glasses off immediately, which made me want to tell him not to, that they didn't diminish him, that nothing could diminish him.
I didn't say any of it. "How do you feel?" he asked.
"Terrible."
I pushed myself up against the pillows.
"Albert."
"I'm sorry."
He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't need to apologize to me."
"I do.
You gave me rules for a reason and Jessica."
His voice stopped me.
He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with an intensity that made breathing complicated. "What happened to you last night was not a consequence of your choices.
It was a consequence of someone else's cruelty. Do not carry that." I stared at him. In all the years I had known this man, he had never spoken to me like that.
Like my well-being was something that genuinely mattered to him, separate from his promise to my father. "Why did you come?"
I asked.
"How did you even know where I was?"
A muscle moved in his jaw.
"I put a tracker in your phone when you arrived.
For your safety." I should have been furious.
"You went through my things."
"I protect what matters to me," he said quietly.
And then he stopped, and the silence that followed was different from all the other silences.
He stood abruptly, set his book aside.
"Rest," he said, and walked out.
But he had said it. What matters to me? He hadn't said your father's daughter. He hadn't said my responsibility. He had said me.
I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling, and felt something shift in the architecture of everything I thought I understood.
Dora was gone by the end of the week.
I only found out because Mrs. Wren mentioned it in passing, and something in the old housekeeper's expression told me she knew more than she was saying. I didn't push.
I filed it away.
The house was different after the night at the Mercer. The silence between Albert and me was still there, but it had changed quality.
It was no longer empty.
It was full of things neither of us was saying, and we both knew it, and neither of us looked away from it as fast as we used to.
He started having dinner at home more. He stopped disappearing behind closed doors the moment I entered a room.
Once, in the library, we spent 2 hours talking about nothing specific, history, finance, a book I had read, and when I finally looked at the clock, it was past 11, and he was watching me talk with an expression on his face that I recognized, finally, because I had been wearing it myself for 6 years.
That was the night I stopped pretending. Not aloud. Not yet.
But inside, I made myself look directly at what was happening instead of around it.
Albert Romano was fighting something. Hard.
The discipline was extraordinary, and the walls were still standing, but they were not unbreakable. And I wasn't the only one who had noticed. 3 days later, he came to find me in the study, where I had been working through some of my university coursework.
He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking.
"Gregor confirmed something this morning," he said. "Reese Holton's father has made noise about retaliation. He claims his son was," he paused, "handled incorrectly."
I looked up from my laptop.
"Was he?"
A pause. "No."
"Then what do we do?"
He looked at me carefully. "We." You said we.
"Isn't that what this is?" I asked. "I've been here 2 months, Albert. Whatever this arrangement started as, it isn't that anymore.
You know it. I know it.
Tell me what's happening so I can be useful instead of a problem you're managing." Something gave way in his face.
Not much.
A hairline fractured in the wall.
But I had been watching this man long enough to know what it meant. He walked into the study. He sat across from me.
And for the first time since I had arrived, Albert Romano talked to me like I was someone who mattered, not to my father, not to his obligation, but to him.
We talked for 3 hours.
About the Holton situation. About how it connected to a larger tension between 3 families. About what my father knew and didn't know, and what Albert was quietly managing in his absence. He walked me through it with the kind of blunt clarity that told me he had been waiting a long time to talk to someone who could actually keep up. When midnight came, neither of us moved. "You're good at this," he said finally. "Reading the shape of a situation." "I learned from watching my father's world my whole life," I said. "And from watching you."
He went still.
"I meant it," I said.
"What I said in the kitchen. I know you called it a fantasy.
But you were wrong."
The clock on the wall ticked.
Outside, the wind moved through the trees.
Albert Romano stood up. He crossed the study.
He stood in front of me, and this close, with the lamplight catching the silver at his temples, he was the most terrifying and beautiful thing I had ever seen.
He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His hand paused against my cheek. Just for a moment.
The lightest, most deliberate touch.
"I know," he said quietly.
"God help me, I know."
Then he stepped back. He left the room.
And I sat there in the lamplight with my heart hammering against my ribs and knew that everything had just changed.
What followed was not simple. Nothing with Albert was ever simple.
We did not speak about what had happened in the study. But something had been acknowledged, silently and completely, and now it lived in the space between us like a third presence in every room. He was careful with me in a new way, not cold, not distant, but deliberate. Like a man carrying something fragile who was very aware of every step he took. I was careful with him, too.
I stopped pushing.
I started watching, and what I saw made my chest ache with a complicated tenderness. Albert Romano, who could order men with a word and run the dark architecture of my father's world without blinking, was genuinely, deeply afraid.
Not of consequences. Not of danger. He was afraid of this.
Of wanting something that crossed a line he had sworn to honor. I understood loyalty. I had grown up watching what it meant to the men in our world.
I knew what my father meant to Albert.
I knew what the blood vow they had made to each other had cost and what it was worth. I was not trying to take that from him. But I was also not going to pretend anymore that what existed between us was nothing. Life in our world was too short and too sharp for that kind of cowardice. We existed in that suspended state for 2 weeks. Long conversations.
Dinners where the air hummed.
Moments in hallways where we stopped close to each other and neither of us moved for a breath too long. Once, his hand found mine in the dark of the back garden and held it for a few seconds before he let go and walked ahead. It was both unbearable and the most alive I had ever felt. Dora Vance, I later learned, had not gone quietly. She had figured out Albert's arrangement and what had replaced it, and she had done what people do when they feel replaced by something they were only ever pretending to be.
She had talked, not to my father directly, but to people who would eventually find a path to him.
The Mafia world ran on information, and Dora had given someone a very valuable piece of it.
We didn't know yet. We were still suspended in our careful, electric almost. Then my father came home. I heard the convoy before I saw it.
3 black cars rolling up the drive on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks early.
No warning call. No advance notice.
Albert and I were in the kitchen when we heard the tires on gravel.
He went still.
I watched his face do something complicated and fast, and then it was perfectly blank. "Stay here," he said.
I did not stay there. I followed him to the front hall and stood at the top of the stairs as my father came through the door.
Marco Antonio looked older than I remembered, or maybe it was just that I was seeing him differently now. He scanned the hall with the sharp eyes of a man who had spent his whole life reading rooms, and they landed on Albert first, then traveled up to me.
The silence was its own kind of violence. "Marco," Albert said. His voice was level. My father said nothing for a long moment.
He handed his coat to one of his men without looking away from Albert's face. He was reading something there, the same way I had been reading it for weeks, and he was far better at it than I was. "Leave us," my father said.
To everyone.
His men, Mrs. Wren, the guards.
They all moved without hesitation. I came down the stairs.
"You too, Jessica," my father said.
"No," I said.
Both men looked at me. "Whatever you have to say, I'm part of it," I said.
My voice was steady. "You left me here, Papa.
You handed me off and disappeared. If there are consequences to that, I'll stand in them."
My father looked at me for a long moment.
Something moved across his face that I couldn't name. Then he turned to Albert.
What followed was not a scene of shouting.
Men like my father and Albert Romano did not shout. The violence of it was all in the quiet. In the particular stillness of Albert's face as my father spoke. In the way, my father's voice dropped lower with each sentence, which was worse than any raised volume.
He had heard things.
He used that word deliberately. heard, leaving space around it for what it contained.
He spoke about trust. About decades.
About what Albert meant to him and what his daughter meant to him and how those two things existed in separate, sacred categories that were never meant to intersect. Albert said nothing through most of it. When my father finally stopped, the silence stretched out long and terrible. "Everything you said is true," Albert said.
His voice was quiet. Every word. "I know what I swore. I know what you are to me.
And I know that what you're feeling right now is right."
My father's jaw tightened.
"But I won't lie to you," Albert said. "I have never lied to you in 30 years, and I will not start tonight."
Your daughter is not a child. She has never been a problem or a liability.
She is the most clear-eyed, capable person I have been near in longer than I can remember. What exists between us is not something I manufactured. It is something I have fought with everything I have.
The room was absolutely still.
"You fought it," my father said. "Yes."
And a pause that lasted a lifetime.
"Not hard enough, Marco. I'm sorry."
My father looked at him. Then he looked at me.
I met his eyes and did not look away because I was done hiding inside the edges of things.
I was done being the thing on the shelf.
"She's my daughter," my father said finally. And it broke slightly, that voice that had never broken in front of me.
Just at the edge of it.
Just enough to tell me what it cost him. "I know," Albert said. "She's also 20 years old and more than either of us have ever given her credit for. That's on both of us." Another terrible silence.
My father turned and walked to the window.
He stood there for a long time, looking out at the dark drive, at his cars, at the world he had built that had brought us all to this room. "If you hurt her," he said finally, his back still to us.
His voice was low and absolutely certain.
"There is no friendship.
There is no history. Do you understand me?"
Albert's answer came without hesitation. "Yes."
My father turned. He looked at me one more time. I didn't see anger there anymore. I saw something exhausted and complicated and real.
"Don't make me regret trusting either of you," he said. Then he walked past us both, up the stairs, and closed the door of his room behind him. That night, Albert and I sat on the back steps of the estate as we had done twice before, in comfortable silence, watching the grounds stretch out into the dark. The air had changed. Everything had changed. "He'll need time," Albert said. "He'll have it," I said.
"He always comes around.
He just needs to believe it was partly his idea." Albert made a sound that was almost a laugh. I had heard him laugh maybe 3 times in my life, and each time it was like finding a door in a wall you thought was solid.
"You know him well," Albert said.
"I know both of you," I said. "Better than either of you knows me."
He was quiet for a moment.
Then he turned to look at me, and in the low light from the house, his face was open in a way I had never seen. The wall was still there. It would probably always be there. It was architectural to who he was, but there was a door in it now, and it was open, and he was standing beside it.
"I'm not an easy man," he said.
"I want you to understand that completely. My life is not safe. What I do is not clean. The things I have ordered and the things I have done are not things that should be romanticized."
"I'm not romanticizing them," I said.
"I grew up in this world, Albert. I see it clearly. Then you understand what it costs." "Yes." I held his gaze. "And I'm still here." He reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and took my hand. He held it the way he had in the garden, carefully, like something he was choosing, and looked down at it for a moment. "Your father will forgive me eventually," he said.
"He always does."
"That's the curse of knowing each other too long." "And us?" I asked. He looked up, those gray-green eyes, full of storm and calculation and something new beneath all of it. Something that had been there for longer than either of us had admitted. "We figure it out," he said simply. "Together. Carefully." With his knowledge and his reluctant, furious blessing. It was not a declaration from a film.
It was not beautiful language or soaring music.
It was Albert Romano who expressed everything important in the plainest possible terms, telling me exactly what he meant. I tightened my hand around his. "Carefully," I agreed. "I can do careful."
He raised an eyebrow.
"You broke 4 rules in the first 2 weeks. I've matured." This time, he actually smiled. Full and real, and it was devastating. I understood now why he kept it locked away. Above us, a light in my father's room clicked off. He was going to sleep. "Tomorrow," There would be more silence and more difficult conversations, and the slow work of rebuilding something that had been cracked but not broken. But tonight, the man I had watched from the edges of my whole life was sitting beside me with his hand in mine, and the world was very, very quiet. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and he did not move away. Some doors, once opened, do not close again. This was one of them. Some dangers come from the outside. Some come from the heart. And the most terrifying thing in this world is not the man who holds a gun, it's the man who makes you stop being afraid of everything else.